Okay, so yes, I like DNA cryptography, but also if they had wanted to talk more, I would have been fine with that. So, okay, so real quick, the topic for this section of the lecture, oops, wrong slides, is going to be DNA cryptography. And yes, this sounds basically as cool as it actually is. So yeah, we'll be going through a couple of the different parts. And real quick, I am one of your guys' local readers, so I've been grading your guys' exams and homeworks and stuff, so cool. Okay, so a quick overview. We're gonna go over RSA really quickly, like in 5 seconds about, and then go over what DNA computing is, and then some current updates about it, and then we're gonna cover like what it could be used for in the future. Because like it or not, even though it's really, really cool, it's not really in practice. It's only really been research right now. It's really not practical to put it into practice yet. Okay, so real quick, RSA, I shamelessly stole these slides from CS160, but I did reference them at the end, so it's not stealing. Okay, so real quick about RSA. Essentially, the idea is you want to send, Alice wants to send a message to Bob, which is the whole theme of this entire class. So Bob essentially at the beginning chooses two very large, in this case, we're thinking 2048-bit distinct primes, P and Q, and we want an E such that you get the greatest common denominator of whatever E is, and then and P minus 1 times Q minus 1 such that the greatest common denominator is 1. And this just means essentially what you will end up having is a value that's really, really hard to guess. Really hard to guess because it's really hard to factor these. Okay, so now we're going to set a public key that Bob has to the values n and e, or the tuple for that, and whereas n is the value of pq, and you compute a private key that's set to D by doing whatever value you have E to the -1, so the inverse mod P minus 1 times Q minus 1. So all of these computations is covered in CS70 briefly and how they actually work, but the slides are linked at the very end if you want more information about proving why these certain things work. So then you have the encryption part actually. And so the encryption part, you have Alice encrypts citations needed. Yeah, I have the citations at the end. Shh, don't worry about that. Okay, so the encryption part, you have the encryption message, which is set to C, and that's defined as the message to the E power and then mod N, which is PQ. So it sends that to Bob, and then Bob, in order to decrypt that, has to set it basically to whatever the encrypted message is to the private key and the mod PQ again. And so all of this mathematically actually really works out in a really nice way because of, I forgot what it was called. Wait, just give me one second. Oh, modular arithmetic, that's what it is. As well as a couple of other different ones. I believe Fermat's little theorem is actually used here. And so if you want the proof for that, go to CS70, not here. Okay. So now we're actually going to go into what the history of DNA computing actually entails. So it actually started in 1994, which seems a long time ago, like it's a long time ago, but it's only in actuality about 25 years ago. So in this scope of the long-term things, it's not really that far ago. And so it was first conceptualized by this guy named Leonard Max Adelman. And this guy, he is the A in RSA. So RSA is three guys' last names for the people who conceptualized it, and the A is Mr. Adelman himself. And he came up with it in the article Molecular Computations of Solutions to Combinatorial Problems, and the essential goal was to solve NP-complete problems. So one of these included the Hamiltonian path problem. So the Hamiltonian path problem is basically the NP-hard or NP-complete version of the traveling salesman's problem, which is something beautiful that you learn about in 170. But essentially what these are is the idea of an NP problem is that it will, with every additional factor, it increases the computational time exponentially. So in any normal algorithm, it'd be really, really hard to solve. So Adelman decided, okay, well, what if we use DNA to actually try to solve these problems? And the idea is because DNA is already inherently used to store and transmit data, aka our living bodies themselves right now, aka every living organism on the entirety of this planet. And so it, he thought, could be the basis of an unbreakable algorithm. So all of these algorithms that Nicholas and Ben just covered so far and throughout the course of this class, they're good, they're great. Some of them are even superb. But the issue with them becomes that if you keep increasing computing power, at a certain point, they always can get broken. And this becomes because we're relying on really difficult mathematical problems. Did I cover it in the next one? Hold on, slides are hard. Okay, but the essential idea is because behind all of these different algorithms and cryptographic schemes results in, it all stems basically from a set of really hard math problems that are, given our current computational devices, it's really hard to crack. So like trying to guess a key, trying to break the discrete log problem, those really are not easy to solve. And when we say easy, it means it's not possible in polynomial time, aka it's not feasible currently. So the idea behind DNA is like, okay, maybe in the future then we will have an unlimited amount of computing power. And in that case, our current cryptographic schemes won't be actually feasible. And so then he took this idea, it's like, okay, use DNA for that. And so parallelism, I guess it's not too important, but basically it's so that it can happen in tandem. So some of the cryptographic schemes we've seen so far, they have to happen in serial. But his idea for this maybe is like, oh, any cryptographic scheme could be parallelized. So, okay, the concept behind here is, let's jump back into high school biology. So all DNA is based off of four bases, or nitrogen bases, and it's adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, so A, T, C, and G. So currently in almost all computing schemes, we have two values that we base it off of, 0 and 1, because we're working with binary, and that's what computers can understand. So theoretically, if you just think about it, if you expand the number of base values that you can actually work with, it can make things a lot more secure just in and of itself. So another reason that why it seems so feasible is because the process of DNA replication is really similar to the way in which the early computer, the first Turing computer, actually worked itself. So for replication, what happens is DNA polymerase unzips the DNA strands so that they become RNA. And then for each section, half of the RNA, it then reads through and then corresponds the base to its opposite base. So in this case, if you read a A, you add on a T. If you read a C, it adds on a G, and vice versa. So then you create two identical strands of new DNA. So the idea behind that is, like you can see here, this is a beautiful little GIF that I found online. So it basically goes through, it starts unzipping things, and then as you unzip it, then you add on the new bases, and then so you pop out with two identical strands of DNA. So the idea is, oh, the Turing machine, not the Turing machine. I am sorry about that. The Turing machine, essentially what happens is the mechanism in which that it works, it moves alongside a pair of tapes. And on one of the tapes is the input tape, and it reads instructions from that, and then it writes the result to the output tape. So essentially, it's sort of the same idea as copying DNA, where you split it in half and then you transfer the two. Albeit it is kind of different, but it worked. Okay, so something that's really nice, this is just a fun little tidbit, but the first Turing computer, it was Turing complete. And that is basically an idea that we use even to this day. And it just means Turing complete means that whatever system that you is describing, it's able to recognize or decide using other data manipulation rule sets. And this is really important because almost all modern computers have to fall within this realm in order to actually be considered computationally feasible. And the very first computer back in the 1930s was actually this, so it's pretty cool. Okay, so then the key question became, can DNA emulate and meet the same computational ability? The answer is theoretically yes. Applicationally, we're still a little bit ways from that, but there have been a lot of research done into this already, so we will look at this. Okay, so for the initial findings, initial experimentation was really, really slow and had to be done a lot of it manually. And you had to separate, basically you had to separate out the correct calculations versus the incorrect one. There were a high number of incorrect ones due to all the errors. And this actually is something that's actually reflective of today's, one of the big hot topics of today's research. So does anyone have any thoughts as to what that might be? So something that starts out extremely slow with a lot of manual computation, and then you have to separate out different things and label it. Any ideas?
Categorization machine learning.
Yeah, exactly. Go away 189. So yeah, exactly. So if it reminds you of anything, that's because it's exactly what modern day ML is like. So it's the whole idea of like, people have to go through and label different images, and you, when you log into things, have to go through the CAPTCHA system and identify what things are lampposts and what things are just poles and things like that. So as with 189, not 189, sorry, ML, as with ML, it starts out really, really slow and it doesn't seem too feasible, but as you get into it and as development goes, it begins to show a lot of promise. So what promise does it show now? Okay, so I'm gonna actually skip this slide real quick, hold on, and jump to this one real quick. So in modern day research right now, we have actually covered quite a few different types of systems. These are the ones that I just picked out and read through because they were pretty cool. So if you guys are curious later, you can just click on the links. But so some really cool systems that have been already developed so far, the symmetric, asymmetric key crypto systems using DNA. So basically the first half of 161. And then you also have DNA steganography, encrypting things in images.
Steganography.
Yeah, that steganography. But encrypting basically images to hold data. So that's also been done with DNA. And you also have triple stage DNA cryptography, which is pretty cool. And then the last one I couldn't find a good research paper for, but it was mentioned and I thought it was pretty good. So it's encryption algorithms inspired by DNA and chaotic computing. And I would recommend giving that a Google if you're curious, because it's pretty cool. Okay, so going back, what advantages does DNA computing give us? Because like right now we're on the verge of like just having supercomputers be like the norm. There's a lot of them. I think there's like what, 200 of them or something like that. My number's probably really wrong in function right now, and some of them are really big. So why DNA? So okay, first and foremost, speed. Conventional computers, so laptops, some really higher process ones, can perform 100 million instructions per second. This MIPS is not the same MIPS as Stanford developed and then crashed and burned. So it's 100 million instructions per second. So in the process of computing DNA strands, it's been already experimentally proven multiple times that you can make computations up to and over 10 to the 9 instructions per second. And I believe that's 1 billion, yeah, 1 billion instructions per second. So that's already 100 times faster than our regular conventional computers. So that's really, really advantageous to us. Something else that's really cool is the amount of storage space needed for DNA. And so DNA, it's in and of itself, it's able to store information at a density of 1 bit per nanometer cubed. So 1 nanometer cubed is very, very, very tiny. But conventional storage methods really needs a space so that it stores 1 bit per 10 to the 12 nanometers per nanometers cubed. And that just is a lot bigger than, it's a lot more, okay, wait, I should have like properly parenthesized this. It's not 10 to the 12 and then the whole thing squared. It's like 10 to the 12 nanometers squared itself. But long story short, it's a lot smaller. So it allows us to store, basically pack more data in a smaller amount of space. And then so, it would be so cool if we were living in a simulation, honestly. It would explain so many things of why the world is so wacko, because it's the people who are controlling the simulation that decided, what if we mess with the world as it is today? Okay, anyway, it's not getting into that. But the third really powerful thing is you need minimal power. So the reason is because when you're performing regular chemical bond interactions for DNA, no additional power is needed from an outside external source. So essentially, the entire thing is closed source. And if you remember anything from chemistry, the general reason behind this is because when bonds form, you release energy. When bonds break, you require energy. And so this is typically, unless you're releasing a lot of heat or consuming a lot of heat, you actually don't need to release or borrow any additional power from an outside source. And if we can maintain that equilibrium, then everything is essentially its closed scope equilibrium. So it's in its own sphere. So theoretically, in the best scenario, we wouldn't actually need to have any additional energy for computing power, which is great. So yeah, one thing about that last one actually today, a lot of what is limited today is the amount of power that is needed to perform things. And from 61C and a couple of, I don't quite remember what other classes, but it mentions like there are certain rules that you have to follow in order, like, oh, this is the amount of power output that you can have, and you have to deal with it in certain ways with like giant heat sinks and things like that. So if we were to use DNA computing for that, it wouldn't actually need all of that hardware. And so that's pretty cool. So for current cryptography, let's bash on that somewhat. So like we said earlier, a lot of current cryptography is based on very difficult mathematical problems. Difficult mathematical problems doesn't mean that it's not solvable or that you can't compute it by hand or anything like that. It just means that with our current computing power, it takes a long time to do and it's just not worth the while. So like one of these is difficulty in factoring very large numbers. And another one that's really key that you probably saw in the midterm was the difficulty in solving the discrete log problem. Something else that has an issue is the keystone, the pinnacle of all of this, having very large keys. So right now, we've been increasing the size of keys regularly, probably on I'd say bi-yearly initially basis, because it's just, if you have, say, like a 2-bit key, very easy to solve, very easy to guess. So then you have to keep increasing the size. So right now, like we saw for the P and Q for the RSA scheme, the standard is around 2048 bits, which is pretty darn large. So, and as you probably saw for the other schemes that we covered in 161, it's generally accepted that you want a pretty large K in order to not actually have it easily cracked. And for a lot of them, you want them to be non-deterministic, you want them to be non-repeated, and you want them to be basically a non-lot of things. And so while that's all good and fine and dandy now, like we said earlier, with the current scope of computing powers, that's not going to hold for very much longer. Well, very much longer in the grand scheme of things, but I guess a while longer right now. Okay. So the problem, it's okay for now, but how fast does computing power grow? Very quickly, exponentially. So, okay, if we take a look at this, we've covered a bit about like what the current DNA cryptography, what the scope is currently. So right now, it's generally confined to the realm of converting the current cryptographic schemes into ones that can be supported by DNA computing. And so, but then that begs the question, what can we do with it in the future? Because that's always the question for this type of research, right? Like, what can you do in the future for all of this? So where could this go? So a couple of them, maybe we could have encrypted organisms. So right now we're trying to artificially create like different types of organs, which has already been really successful. Bioengineering organs specifically out of just some stem cells. And so the next step could potentially be, what if you then create an organism themselves that its only purpose is to hold encrypted information? Then that also has the question, what if we have drug mules but with data? So right now, if you use drug mules to like pass off drugs, which is not recommended, but happens. What if then this happens where you're trying to pass illegal data, but in the form of some kind of organism or some kind of DNA? How will you be able to check that? Okay, what about storing personal information on the person? So right now, everyone has social security numbers, passports, all of these numbers associated with them. What if at some point then you can programmatically input that into yourself and change maybe or maybe insert some sort of like DNA thing so that you can like track it on a certain part of your body or like in a certain type of cell or something like that. Sounds kind of crazy and very sci-fi right now, but totally possible in the future. Yeah. Wait, what? Wait, then what was the question? How do you know this? Oh, shh. Good drug mules never talk. Anyways, on that note, on that sort of note, then we have the manipulation of existing DNA. So right now, there's a lot of bioethics questions that surround the idea of, well, can you actually change your current DNA composition? Because like it or not, we have a lot of just trash DNA that doesn't actually get used. And so what if theoretically we go back and we can change part of that to store information, to enhance things, to potentially store dangerous and secret information? Maybe at some point, like say if you're Snowden, instead of sneaking out different files, you just inject yourself, and something manages to be able to sneak out that, but in terms of like DNA, in the terms of drug DNA. I saw Nicholas laughing at me over that, but like the idea sounds absolutely insane, but it's very much possible with in the future, maybe not in the next 50, 100 years, but after that, if humans live that long. Okay, so then that's the giant question, the big red question mark. How might this be dangerous for the future? How could it be exploited? Think big, not think big. So I don't know. I'm curious, what do you guys think about that? Like where might this go wrong? What could happen with this? Like there's so many questions already surrounding the field of biocomputation and bioethics that like this is puts another giant question mark on that page. The whole idea of cloning a human, that was something that was so hotly debated after Dolly the sheep got cloned, and that was just cloning. Now this could be something very, very, very different. So right now in the grand scheme of things, it's not something that's possible. So I guess it's not something that you hear on the street where it's like, what do you think about DNA computation? What do you think about changing your DNA to hold government sensitive information? But who knows? It could be a thing in the future. Yeah, Fran, brand new take on eugenics. That would be very interesting. So yeah, right now we're exactly at 6 o'clock, and I have just this slide full of resources that I used for this. So if you guys are curious, this is some of the stuff that I was reading about. But yeah, this is definitely not as like diagrammy technical as the whole Nicholas Ben signal love affair, but hopefully this was interesting to you guys, and it presents some new questions that you hadn't really considered before. So thank you.